here. You've done amazing work putting everything together. So thank you to Matot and to all of the faculty who have been in touch to put everything together tonight. This is extraordinary. Thank you for the invitation. And I hope I will say one or two things that folks will find interesting or provocative. My career has been deeply interdisciplinary, but the description of the program in urban design and international relations is the kind of community that I've come to feel very welcome in, and to find new answers and to ask new questions that have not come out of previous research and press the edges. And so, no further ado, this is my talk on Wakanda, Afrofuturism, and the future of cities. I've done maybe 50 different kind of iterations of this talk for different specific communities in the last 3 or 4 years. I've been nearly dumbstruck, breathless. My breath has been taken from me by the widespread interest. I did not expect it at all when we started doing some of this work. And so I'll walk through kind of the origins. There's, convoluted, a little meandering to kind of explain how I got to the point of doing this kind of work, and then where it's gone in the last few years, and hopefully with the students and the faculty present, where it can go next, where we can see it go in the next decade. And so before I start, I want to share something that hopefully many of you have seen, but I need it as a point of reference to kind of explain everything else that follows. So this is my lab page, and I need to, there we go. Let me stop and share again, because I have to make sure that you all have sound. So I want to stop there, particularly with this backdrop before it fixates on the characters. The amount of time and effort it took to negotiate and settle on a space that could speak to African cultural diversity, but be accessible or recognizable to a variety of people around the world, to challenge the notions that have been embedded as Africa as a rural continent, a place that did not have urban spaces, to do that in a relatively short frame and to make that impression so that people could engage the notion of this fictional nation took years. For me, I was involved with the writers for the better part of a decade, maybe 13 years before people started publicly talking about what was going into the actual formulation of what was going to be captured in terms of the cinematography. But I have to open with that because it is the symbol of just a miracle, something I never thought would be real, something I never thought I would see in an American film. And so from there, let's get into the heart of the talk. This never gets old. This premise for Ryan Coogler as director, writer, speaking through Chadwick Boseman, as someone as in character familiar with this place intimately, having been a product of the narrative ancestry. He's speaking for the audience that this moment of seeing a different vision of the African continent, of seeing the ideals, the possibilities of a liberated African diaspora, is tapping into something deep and emotional to counter just generations of film that stereotyped and dehumanized people of African ancestry in any number of ways. And so that is exactly what my work has been in urban studies. And I never anticipated that kind of the work I did on the side about kind of science fiction, about fantasy, about bringing a global array of voices into media, into television and movies and audiobooks. The sentence that never gets old is the feeling of many of the folks I've worked with for 20, 25 years about the recognition of African-American, African diaspora humanity. And so I wanted to start after seeing that shot, that opening experience of a fictional African nation that had never been touched by colonialism and slavery and segregation, to start with the idea of Wakanda as a fiction and as a concept. And so as a fiction, many people are aware at this point, but I don't know everyone is, that it's created by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, the end of 1965 into early 1966, as they were writing the Fantastic Four comics. They wanted to do a storyline based in Africa. They wanted it to be a portrayal of Africa that countered stereotypes of poverty and lack of development. They wanted it to be comparable to the things they had seen and written about Thor and Asgard. They wanted it to be an ideal place, a utopia, and essentially a Black utopia, a utopia for people of African descent, people of African heritage, and that this concept evolves. It initially is very much about the technological sophistication of the society. Those comics worked as a kind of sideline, a side story to this narrative of white astronauts exploring the universe in new ways, the kind of parable of what the Fantastic Four were. But to revisit the story through the 70s, it became increasingly about a Tarzan mythology, where the Jungle Action books by McGregor basically delved into the Black Panther as a Black Tarzan allegory, struggling against a variety of primitive forces, trying to maintain a advanced society, but often caught in a kind of mixed martial arts version of these stories, where he's being cut, he's being bloodied, he's being knocked out, and struggling to overcome extraordinary physical adversity to ultimately triumph in the end. Those two generations of stories were never really challenged as a framework until the late 1990s. And so from the framing of the Panther character, Wakanda does not get to what we could even see as possible in that scene until about 1998, 1999, when Christopher Priest, who is a veteran, one of the earliest African Americans to begin writing for the major two comic companies, took the character and basically fused it with a lot of blaxploitation Hollywood cinematography, mainly from Shaft and Kofi, Cleopatra Jones kinds of images, and then takes the sense of the country itself and makes it the centerpiece of what he says is the Black Panther is not a superhero. The Black Panther is a combination of a national leader, a prime minister, a monarch, and a religious figure, a pope, and that his powers are not about energy rays or about the different kinds of spectacular tools that he'll put forth, but it's about his political sophistication, his wisdom, his spiritual grounding among his people. And Priest changes the entire formulation of Black Panther, and that's essentially where I entered. I was doing work early in my graduate process, finishing my dissertation, talking about Black communities that have been destroyed by the process of suburbanization, and how small Black communities were completely flanked and outdone by the scale of the economic forces that surrounded them and could not survive the social and political changes happening around them. And so in talking with Priest about my work and talking about Wakanda as a place that was the opposite, a place that was unassailed by these social and demographic changes, we started speculating on ways that Wakanda could actually dominate economically, why their economic power would be comparable to anything technologically that they had. And so at the end of the first year of his writing, those elements of the story became more prominent. And a couple of years later, he stopped writing the stories. The books weren't selling as well. They got a new author, and this was Reginald Hudlin, who at the time was president of entertainment at Black Entertainment Television. And he saw the capacity to make Black Panther animated series, the Black Panther movie. And so in dialogue with him, a lot of the basic elements of what would Wakandan skyscrapers look like? How would the transportation system work? What does Wakandan banking operate like? All of those kind of nitty-gritty details that are familiar to urban planners and urban designers. I was pressing Hudlin on these things from like 2007 to 2010. And it shaped a lot of the stories that ended up in the comics. But of course, the most interesting that happens is in 2008, the Iron Man movie does enormously well. And at that point, we realized at some point, 10 years later, 20 years later, there would be a Black Panther movie because this genre was just taking off. This idea of the Marvel Cinematic Universe was taking off. And at that point, we made a choice to ground this idea of a fictional Wakanda in the concepts of ancient Ethiopia, in the idea of this kind of African continent that was always reduced to kind of farce or peripheral, or in Joseph Conrad's terms, a dark continent. We wanted to make it about an enduring tradition of independence. We wanted to incorporate as much as we could theories and debates around Pan-Africanism. We wanted it to resonate across the African diaspora. And so what had been a kind of fictional creation by white authors in the 60s and 70s was very purposefully reimagined and redesigned brick by brick to become the kind of cinematic experience that we just saw in the opening video. And this set the table for the public to begin to engage with this idea that Mark Derry launched out of New York in the 1990s is Afrofuturism. And really at the heart of Afrofuturism were the ideas of Alondra Nelson, now working in the Biden administration, gifted scholar talking about African-American scientists and breakthroughs in science that are challenging the notions of people of African descent not participating in the Enlightenment, in scientific and technological breakthroughs in the last 200 years. And so Afrofuturism as a theoretical frame is very much like what Carter Woodson was doing back at the beginning of the 20th century as Harvard's first graduate as a PhD in history. When he launches Negro History Week, he is challenging the idea that people of African descent have no past. There is no history worth studying. Pernicious mythology of white supremacy that still persists. You still see people argue. I believe our Prime Minister of France just made a claim about the absence of history in Algeria. And so the assumption that there is no African history, there is no African diaspora history, is still too prevalent and fuels a lot of the assumptions about the way the world operates and who is civilized and who is not. And so Afrofuturism in the 1990s comes out of a lot of artistic expression, particularly in hip hop music with groups like Outkast or Missy Elliott or Busta Rhymes, that they're playing with these kinds of surreal images in their music and in their videos to say that not only is there a history of the African diaspora, but there are also infinite futures, unlimited possibilities of growth and development and change and agency. And so this kind of imagining of futures of the African diaspora and the African continent, you can go back to an artist like Sun Ra as an experimental jazz musician. You can go back to any number of Black writers and artists who have imagined the future of possibilities for people of African descent. The anti-colonial independence struggles are all in some ways Afrofuturist struggles, looking for self-determination, going back even to folks like Marcus Garvey or T. Thomas Fortune or Ida B. Wells Barnett. They're all projecting and countering a notion that not only do people of African heritage have no past, but they also have no future. And science fiction writers for 50 years had imagined futures where there were no people, where everyone was white. and that some disaster had befallen all people of color, that somehow there was no future for them. And so at the heart of this work on Afrofuturism, as it moved into the 21st century, Stanford University published a series of magazines called Black Arts Quarterly that was publishing early Black science fiction, building off of the interest in Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler's work, for me personally, it was the Xenogenesis series that opened my eyes to what was possible and how to tell science fiction centered on Black women. But ultimately, when I met her, as I read every book she wrote, and it was the Parable series that remain at the heart of the kind of work I do, because her grasp of the dynamics of community in Parable of the Sower, when a social disaster unfolds and people must struggle to maintain their dignity and to protect their loved ones, forming a new faith system that gives a lodestone, gives a way for people to negotiate the horror that unfolds around them. Parable of the Sower shows that community is possible even under the worst conditions. And then in the sequel, Parable of the Talents, she basically lays out the consequences of forming new community and the political challenges, and how a new generation may reject the values of an older generation that struggled through adversity. And so Butler's work served as a torch, as a beacon that showed the way for so many of us who were growing up through the 80s and 90s to find a way to reimagine not just history and not just literature, but to expand it to the ideas of mathematics, to the principles of physics, that everything could in fact be reinvented. And so Black Arts Quarterly was a great space. There's another online community called Degrio Space, where several dozen authors got together. It was essentially a listserv where people shared a lot of the short stories and initial novel chapters that ended up building into early 20th century Afrofuturism. But the art that shaped it most of all in the last 15 years came from these two gentlemen on the screen. On the right is John Jennings, on the left is Stacey Robinson. Behind them are just portraits of writers and artists that they identified as either historic figures, Zora Neale Hurston to the bottom right corner, Fannie Lou Hamer right in the middle behind them, Kais Lehman above Hamer. Just an amazing event in Jackson, Mississippi in 2016 that brought together 100 people who all shared this spirit, shared this feeling about doing this work, but had never been able to kind of sit down and share that experience in community. And so that moment, along with, it was Jennings as host, along with Ronaldo Anderson of Harris Stowe University, who's written multiple books on Afrofuturism and the Black speculative arts movement. Yatasha Womack in Chicago continues to write and produce new film on this topic. My close collaborator, Julian Chambliss, shows how the real and imagined spaces like Wakanda help us reimagine what we can build going forward. But it was the Astro Blackness Conference at Loyola Marymount in Los Angeles in 2015 and the Planet Deep South Conference in Jackson in 2016 that then set the table for why Black Panther was successful, why people began to take these ideas more seriously and think about what we could literally build. And this is the section where I hope we can spend a lot more time talking about possibilities. So I'm going to stay and talk through some of the process here. I promise I won't chew up the whole time. We got lots of time to talk with each other. But in 2016, coming out of Planet Deep South, which Chambliss and I both attended, he and I had met in 2009 at an urban planning conference. I saw Steve Reguer was here as another member who was part of one of these events in Los Angeles, or Cleveland, my fault. It was actually 2017 in Cleveland where Steve came out. But this idea of urban planning, regional planning, urban design, we were having these conversations at these conferences every year and struggling with the absence of Black architects, both in the present moment and in the historical engagement. We were struggling with traditions of Black urban and suburban planning that were absent, and we weren't really engaging that literature. Particularly work by Mary Corbin Sees and by June Manning Thomas. More familiar to folks was Joe Trotter's work in African American urban history, but still a kind of marginal voice within the profession. And so we were determined to find a way to bring those voices to the center in urban studies broadly and begin to support young scholars, folks who are in undergraduate studies, folks who are in graduate studies, to ask more of these questions, to use more of this evidence to kind of challenge the parameters of what we had entered when we were graduate students. And so there were a series of books and online projects that spun out of this. And I would say as 2016, we published Wakanda Syllabus, first kind of asserting that the broad array of Afrofuturist work could help us reimagine nearly every line of inquiry in the academy. That was built a lot on this book called American Economy that basically challenged the parameters of neoliberal economic thought in publication. And now folks like William Darity and Trevon Logan, Mariette Mora are making great inroads to kind of free us from the boundaries of an economics that perpetuates neocolonialism. So it works. We're able to think and ask different questions by engaging in the Black speculative arts. In 2017, we published Planning Future Cities, which is largely about segregation and its evolution from the urban scale to the metropolitan scale. Industrial segregation was about the origins of segregation after the end of racial slavery, after the Emancipation Proclamation, that instead of just simply seeing one form of racial segregation, we can actually see there are agricultural forms of racial segregation, industrial forms of racial segregation, and now these metropolitan technological or digital forms of racial segregation. And so it lets us escape from the de facto versus de jure discussions that just says, oh, if it's by law and it's formal, that's Jim Crow. Or if it's de facto and it's just by habit or custom, well, that's largely outside of the South. It lets us ground ourselves in the municipal level, in the local and the state level decisions that actually made segregation quite nuanced and opened doors for us to see slavery, racial slavery, in a different light as well. So all that work is 2015, 2016, 2017. And even before the movie dropped, it was the Unite the Right rally that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, that I woke up the morning after I had heard the news of Heather Heyer being killed and run over during the counter protest. And I saw everyone on social media saying that this was not America, this was not who we are. And it just blew me away because I had spent 15 years teaching about racial violence. And so I just put up a series of resources, and the social media response was overwhelming. For 2 weeks, people kept on demanding more information and translating it and sharing it. And so that combination of documenting racial violence and the destruction of African diaspora places, and then the loss of their histories as part of this larger project to say that they were unimportant or to say that they had no real economic value, that set the table for everyone to be hungry for this image of Wakanda. That to see the idea of a fictional place that was prosperous, that was advanced, that they were not accustomed to dealing with this framework of Black prosperity, especially in spatial terms and architectural terms. We had planned from 2016 to have Cities Imagined appear just as the movie was coming out. We certainly did not anticipate the success that the movie would have. But the fourth chapter of Cities Imagined is all about fictional space. How do we imagine places like Gotham City? How does Charles Dickens deal with a place like London in his literature? How do we actually begin to, even in video games, map out where something is happening and what are the spatial dynamics that shape the reader, the audience's experience of the fiction? And so this premise sparked a lot of conversation and continues. In fall of 2019, about a year and a half later, we had a multi-site exhibit showcasing Afrofuturist art and literature and kind of using the history and the critical analysis of these spaces and expressions to open the door to bridge new kinds of media, especially in pedagogy. And so at that point, I want to step back for just a second and talk about the graduate training that I received in urban history at Temple and that I shared with colleagues, you know, at Columbia or at Chicago, at Michigan, where Chicago as a space in the 20th century dominates the landscape. To a lesser extent, Detroit or New York or Los Angeles or Cleveland were kind of the models, the places we were trained to understand and analyze and examine how they changed over time. And so this notion of ghettos in the toolbox, in the epistemology of sociology and history, shaped a lot of the 20th century and were the basic ways we came to look at Black community. And so that was troubling. Certainly as a graduate student, I knew there were prosperous Black communities that we were not necessarily always accounting for. You know, I think of St. Clair Drake and some of the work that was going on even prior to my mentor's graduate training, John Hope Franklin's work, of course. And so beyond ghettos and kind of this experience of marginalization and lack of agency, increasingly following the example of Robin D.G. Kelley in many ways, colleagues and I were fixated on these questions of abolition and desegregation, abolition in the 19th century, desegregation in the 20th century. And where were the structural, the institutional foundations that enabled Black communities to rewrite the law, to push back on what they found to be these rigid, even violent barriers that showed up within these larger structures of urban studies. And so most recently, my colleagues have been working a lot with Saidiya Hartman's work on Wayward Lives and on Catherine McKittrick's work on Demonic Grounds to really drill down and look at the grassroots level experience that then aggregates and builds to the place that it can transform the function of public institutions. And so how does that agency, how does that process unfold? And I was very fortunate in 2016 and 2017 to work with Kim Gallen and with Angel David Nieves as part of a National Endowment of Humanities Office of the Digital Humanities project on what they called the Black Digital Humanities. And so I looked at 4 places where across over 400 years, people of the African diaspora were able to escape slavery, escape segregation, and build their own autonomous communities. And so in Montreal, in Havana, Savannah, Georgia, Philadelphia, there were these different models of Black agency that manifested in the landscape. When I looked at people like Angelique in Montreal, who was hung for destroying a section of the city, burning it down to kind of try and sabotage the slave trade there, or Gaspar Yanga in Mexico, who routinely raided supply lines between Veracruz and Mexico City to maintain a community that now bears his name southeast of the capital. Gabriel Prosser in the Southeast United States, but most notably, because I was in that area, I could talk in great detail about Richard Allen and William Still and how Philadelphia kind of tolerated the existence of a free Black community, but never invested in it the way it invested in its white doctors and its lawyers and its small merchants in textiles and cigar making. I am struck over and over again by the persistence of African American, African diaspora leaders to build something out of nothing, not just against the hostility of the larger white social and economic structure, but to also build without any active investment and without any substantial effort to make Richard Allen's system of AME churches really thrive. They do, but there's virtually no white investment in helping them pull that off. And so this is the kind of work I'm doing now. This is the work that my students are doing. And the most direct manifestation of what they've done came from our spring of 2018 class that used the Cities Imagined book and resources to basically explore places of African American and African diaspora agency. And with about 6 weeks left in the class, the students began to research on their own the communities that they were most interested in at different points in time that tended to represent turning points in the histories of those communities. And so I'd say with 3 weeks left in class, they were well versed enough that they could ask pretty sophisticated questions about the history of the landscape design and the evolution of the urban landscape and the suburban landscape of several African American communities across the country. And so instead of a final exam, the students would pair off and ask each other questions about all the places they had studied together. And they loved it as a game. My games in this context, there are no ways that you can fail technically, but you have so much time to prepare that no one has failed when I've been running these activities. And in asking each other questions and testing each other, they enjoy it much more than when it's just me designing the exam and them answering with a blue book or sitting with their laptop and typing out, a 5 to 7 page essay to complete the course. The interaction of seeing what they've learned and verifying and recognizing what their classmates have learned made for an extraordinarily dynamic experience. And so that activity that we would do in that class was called semiosis, where people choose up to 64 different examples from the class, and then they can ask their classmates about any of them. And then the class as a whole looks at what's correct, and it decides how they whittle down the material to see who did the best work. But there is a reward for all the students. These are all extra credit points that they're scoring on their final grade. And so the semiosis activity that year was especially compelling because they saw the Black Panther movie, because they got to use the Cities Imagined book. And so the activity is based on combining questions about philosophy, questions about critical media studies or media ecology, questions about urban design, questions about African diaspora history. And so those interdisciplinary materials help them ask very specific, but also very rigorous questions of each other. In the end, the 3 best designs were rendered as PowerPoints where they could share with someone who hadn't taken the course how to learn the material in relatively short order. The PowerPoint designs that they made, I wrote an academic paper around the concepts and the methods. I used them to build the exhibit that was featured at a place called the T. Thomas Fortune Center, which is a community center, a historic landmark that we were able to restore at the point that it was about to collapse. And so it was a way to show the reality of restoring prosperous Black locations here in the United States. But I took all of that work to New Zealand for a presentation in 2019. It was online for a SALA, Carter Woodson's Black History Organization, for a presentation last fall, in Boston for a presentation this past fall, and then now, in the last month, the Michigan State University's Global Digital Humanities have featured it. And now in New Orleans, we're restoring a new set of historic sites, the Herman, Grima, and Gallier houses. and building a historic preservation model based out of the virtual gaming platform. And the most exciting news is that the National Park Service has reached out to help restore over 1,000 African-American community centers around the country, so that in every state, people can go and explore and learn the kinds of histories that we've been working on as part of this Black speculative arts revolution, this moment of kind of confronting what we can do differently. And so I'm gonna let you see the game for a minute and then open up the floor for a few questions that we can discuss. Let's see. There we go. So I want to say the Compton, California level is midway through the game, maybe level 6 or 7. There are 10 levels to the game. I'll share the link when we get out of here so everybody can kind of play on their own and see what they think of all the content. All the content, I edited it in some basic ways just for grammar and keep it more clear, but this all came out of different questions the students were asking each other for the class. And so the actual game is done with a program called Articulate that lets you make it interactive and exploratory. This is an actual map of Compton, circa 1990. And so all of the numbered sites are sites of major historical events, and often the questions are tied to learning the specific history of the community. We can adapt the game format so that you can ask just about any kind of question about any subjects. We've done it for accounting, we've done it for mathematics. And so if there's a subject you want to teach, but you want to have a basic game platform to use within it, the Sojourner's Trail engine can do that for you. So questions about Ice Cube. Right now, you can only follow the path to the numbers. It's not flexible enough to follow all the erroneous paths. And we're also rendering this in 3D with Unity so that each of the urban environments, instead of it being kind of above, you're kind of at an aerial view negotiating the maze, you'll actually be able to be at ground level, at eye level, and go from place to place and interact at different buildings. You can get the answers wrong, but it doesn't set you back to the beginning of the game the way our first version did. My instructional technologist, Megan Alice, was absolutely crucial to helping us build this. The Maulana Karenga founded the US organization. And so let's see if I can actually get through here in fast order. Yep, question about Butler because it's grounded in the same region. I believe it was Robledo, yep. And then it moves you on to the next level. So 7th maze, we're on to the 8th maze, which is a place outside Texas. Actually, it was just in the New York Times a couple of days ago, so where a highway destroyed a big chunk of Independence Heights. And so we explore some of that history. But that's what I wanted to share with you all today, that the concepts of the movie built the actual film, but are now building into these kinds of interactive academic products that I hope will be really useful to other folks. The last bit is my thanks for y'all bearing with me as I talk through everything. The questions we tend to ask around a lot of this content: how do we study cities and suburbs more effectively? Is gamification appropriate for urban design education? And then why is it important to document towns and cities that represent Black liberation over time? So 3 basic things, but hopefully spark us to ask lots of other questions and explore other topics. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Greason. I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask, and then we can open it if people have questions. So the first one is about one of the books that you mentioned, The Parable of the Sower, and the sequel. So could you talk about the significance of the main character being not just a Black woman, but also a very young woman in the context of science fiction space? So that's my first question. The
Yeah,
second,
I'm sorry.
uh, would you like to
No,
answer
no,
the
no,
first
you
and
can
I
get
ask?
both. Go for it.
Okay. So my second question is, the movie Wakanda is very successful and very popular. And if you could comment on how that might help change the stereotypes about the African continent and people of African descent that you mentioned in the beginning.
So yeah, I try to be upfront that I just love Octavia Butler, and particularly the two Parable books. Uh, Sower is my favorite novel, and Talents is really not far behind. I actually, in some ways, love Talents more because it's more of an urban design book. It's more about community development and the contradictions within it. Specifically about the protagonists. As young Black women facing enormous adversity, I have to say up front, Butler's conception of hyper empathy that she inflicts on the first protagonist, that when she sees someone hurt, her brain convinces her that she's also been injured. I identify with that really deeply. Like, I can't watch fictional violence very much. It's hard for me to tolerate, especially sexual violence. And so I connected with the character just in a profound way in that way. But for the character herself, it's that hyper empathy that enables her to dedicate her life to protecting her loved ones, to creating safe communities. It's a metaphor for what a lot of Black women's experience in activism has been around the world, is that it's a sensitivity and awareness, a thoughtfulness, and often a restraint to kind of put care first, but do it in a way that is not about domesticity. It's about agency. It's about the way they are shaping their world actively in every phase, and communicating with honesty and integrity about who we are, what our limitations are, what our strengths are, and what we can achieve together. The hyper empathy aspect of the protagonist in Sower was really what roped me in at first. And then her maturity, her experience in overcoming and facing the loss of her parents, facing just devastating horror as trying to find a new home. Um, it speaks to a deep resilience that often is not honored in science fiction about Black women. And so that's at least in the first novel. Her daughter has a very different take on the original novel's protagonist in the sequel. And so she feels like she's very judgmental of her mother, which I think is also very important to talk about relationships between parents and children, but also particularly between mothers and daughters. And that generational inheritance and the sense of misunderstanding, the sense of being independent and making your own choices regardless of what you inherit. Those questions are all really powerful. And yeah, I think tonight I'd say Talents is my favorite for at least the next hour or so. But like, the nuance and the humanity that she captures is unlike any other writer. You know, even I love Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is so powerful. You've got to be really careful. I've got to be really careful how often I take her in. But to me, there's just a feeling that Butler is able to capture that's in some ways more visceral than what I get when I read Toni Morrison, although Beloved still knocks me out of my chair every time I try. So, you know, to me, I enjoy talking about the two of them in dialogue a lot. I think about Octavia Butler's kindred in connection to Beloved all the time. And so, no, that I could talk for another hour just about Butler and her characters and how important it is that she wrote the material that she did, and how important it is that we've captured it, turned it into graphic novels, how it's becoming movies, and more people will be able to engage with her mind. On the second question, where, say it one time for me. I got caught off talking about Butler.
Sure. So you talked about how successful Wakanda is, and we all know it's
Oh
very
yeah.
popular. So how does that help change the stereotypes about the continent, the African continent, and also people of African descent, if it does at all?
Yeah, that's the goal. And it's not to say the film itself is going to make it happen alone, but I think it opens doors of opportunity to bring the Nigerian film industry into the global marketplace, for instance, in greater depth, and any number of the film industries across the continent. I will be very frank, when I started teaching history at the college level, one of the basic lessons I had to teach was African geography and political geography, and just where national boundaries were, and the fact that Africa was not a country. And so, you know, now there's an awareness that there are, 56, 57 countries on the continent that just Westerners didn't seem to engage with. And I often look back at Hollywood in particular and the ways they romanticize kind of Anglophone tourism of the continent that really rendered African people as a backdrop. And I mean, even with Black Panther, you had people reject the idea of an advanced African society and say, well, this is just a remake of The Lion King. And it was just grotesque that they could not engage with the idea that there was a level of civilization and sophistication among African people, even in fiction. They just could not escape the colonial imagination, this kind of colonial gaze that just anything that deviated from it had to be completely false and ridiculous. And so just breaking that initial instinct to reject the humanity of the African continent and diaspora, I think is really important. But then beyond that, the additional investment to show that those kinds of projects can be successful financially, that they have weight and can connect emotionally across different cultures. It's not necessarily decolonial, but I do think it's anti-colonial. Like, I don't think it undoes necessarily the kind of colonial theoretical underpinnings that we face, but it does help us fight back against them and give us a chance to move towards different kinds of institutions, different types of organizations that can actually help us see our common humanity.
Thank you. So if I could ask you to stop sharing so we can see
Yes.
everybody.
I didn't know if I needed to keep the question up. So I hope folks, if you want to talk about those, just let me know. I'll put it back.
Okay. So we'll just open the floor, and if people have questions.
They're laughing at me. I see them. They're like,
I'll start. Hi, Walter. Good to see you.
great to see you, sir.
And it was great that this was happening when I'm on break and I had time to do it. I have lots of questions about the game, but the one I want to ask the most is thinking of it as a design tool and for places like Cleveland or Detroit, where the on-the-ground evidence of the prosperous Black middle class that's, was there is so lacking. Have you thought about sort of AR, kind of, AR, VR versions of this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I can, I just think with architecture students, that could be incredibly powerful.
I mean, the folks there at Cleveland State, yeah, at the front edge, cutting edge of it. And so, yes, no, that's the whole point of doing this kind of work, is to give a toolbox to all the folks who love this material and give it a way that we can see something that no longer exists, and to see it at different stages. Brian Carter at Arizona, he has this extraordinary recreation of Harlem that you can explore. And it's basically just one block, but like, to be able to have that tool for all these different kinds of places, I'd love to get very old and see several hundred of them created before I'm done with all this. So absolutely.
Thanks.
Yes, sir. No, we need to talk more often.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I have a question.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Walter, as you know, urban planning, and some of the other design disciplines, architecture, even urban studies, have a diversity problem. What should the planning profession be doing? What should these professions be doing in order to make their disciplines more attractive to a broader range of uh, of, of people, of students, particularly for the academic programs?
Yeah, you're gonna get me in trouble on this one. I appreciate the question. I'm really grateful because there's so much we can do, but it's often hard given the really strenuous burdens we carry as faculty. You know, the combination of our scholarly production, our commitments to teaching, the service we often do in our local and regional communities. You know, the folks that you're emphasizing already are superheroes. They're doing things that are above and beyond what anybody could ever ask. Now, what I'm about to say kind of builds on that, and it's more of a challenge, I'd say, to assistant and associate deans and provosts, so less directly to the faculty who are leading and shaping these departments and programs. Funding. There's got to be the effort to build extended funding into these various design programs. They're expensive. They are ridiculously expensive to keep the materials, to have the tools you need to inspire people to come on board and do the work. And then beyond that, as they move out into the professions, they're expensive professions to belong to and to continue to innovate and grow within. And so I literally saw a note before I came in here that someone had given a $100,000 gift to an institution to foster interdisciplinary collaboration between a history department and an English department. And that was generating $5,000 a year for faculty members to collaborate with students and do the kinds of projects we all recognize and love. And that's not a big lift, is to find someone to give $100,000. There are more rich people on this side of the planet than you could ever imagine. And they want to do good work. It's really incumbent upon provosts and deans to work with their development officers at the institutions to have a goal to say, we're going to raise $250,000 this year for our architecture program. We're going to raise $500,000 this year for our planning program. And I'm not saying they don't have lots of work and lots of responsibilities to do too, but that's a huge, major responsibility institutionally that we can't grow and attract more people to what we do without that. And so I want to say, back when I had my first program director job, I was in Africana Studies program at a small liberal arts college. And the history department there had a $4,000 a year budget with like 7 faculty. And everybody in Africana Studies was part-time. Like they had like quarter of their time was given to Africana Studies officially. And Africana Studies had no budget. So I went to a local philanthropist who wanted Africana Studies to be a more prosperous piece of the academic community. And that person gave me $5,000 a year to help support students and their research and their travel to conferences. $5,000 didn't mean a whole lot to that person, but it meant everything to the students who came through that program. And so we went from having 1 student to having over 30 students, and they were graduating with the highest GPA of any academic unit in the college. So it doesn't have to be big numbers, but we need the folks who are leaders to give a little bit of time, 5% of their time, 10% of their time, to getting significant institutional gifts that help us bring new people into our programs and then help them find success both in the program and beyond. That's why I said you were going to get me in trouble.
We have another question. Joey, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I've got my headphones in. I didn't know whether you could hear me or not. Thank you for the presentation. It was just really informative, and I'd love to learn more, honestly. I, I was just wondering, in your research, were there any patterns of development that you teased out, looking at sort of these communities in Montreal, Havana that you mentioned? Were there any patterns of development that you teased out that you think, well, first of all, were there any patterns of development that you teased out? And then also, do you think, if there were, could they, what's the likelihood that we could incorporate some of those patterns of development into zoning ordinances today? I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, these are some of my favorite stories. So it depends, of course, what century, what decade you're in, and which places allow you the most. But one great example that's current is out in Kansas City. Is that the city adopted a community gardens model that they basically underwrite with a budget every year, and so they allow for this system of community gardens that allow kind of supplemental foods for people who struggle. And so they're literally feeding the hungry by zoning in agricultural production within the urban space. And so there are folks who do this with like rooftop gardens. There are a variety of ways people go at it. But those kinds of sustainable strategies where it's not the kind of traditional, all this area is going to be industrial, all this area is going to be commercial, all this area is going to be residential. It's really thinking through this idea of mixed uses, even at a very micro level. And so how do you begin to blend retail residential, but also incorporate something that might be an agricultural use? Colleague of mine on environmental sustainability loves to talk about the Charleston metro area and efforts to preserve kind of indigenous plant life that basically comes out of the Geechee and the Gullah culture, but can be built around these larger parking lots, garages, ways that they actually let people gather free food and important medicinal plants that are aligned with older traditions prior to industrialization and modern kind of development. And so to me, there's a lot of looking back. And yes, there's a lot of potential for really amazing innovation if we just let go of kind of core assumption that everything must be built over, and if it's old, it's bad. The ways that we can kind of adaptively reuse. You're hitting at a core point for me. I just took someone on a walk of a space that was a Black community that had been kind of paved over earlier today, and just the absolute waste of not even trying to be thoughtful about the people who live there, the kinds of cultural practices that they embodied, the ways that their lifestyles could have been improved without destroying the foundation of everything that they relied on. So, those kinds of experiences, that's why it's such a huge priority for me to get people like the National Park System and partnerships with EPA and DOT to not just do business as usual, to really think through what their impacts are and not repeat bad habits that came from people like Robert Moses.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Other questions?
I had a question regarding
Sean.
architecture. So I'm very well versed in historical preservation issues where you preserve the fabric, but you don't actually preserve the community that's there. So the issue of gentrification. But going back to like Wakanda, what it represents, that like kind of idealistic and attractive Afrofuturism, that actual architectural style that reflects historic Africa. Are there's projects that's reflecting that today, or is it still like modern architecture's not really allowing for that to come in the fold?
Yeah, so I've seen a few folks in Canada, a couple folks in the US too, going at great length to document forms of more traditional African architecture and make it so it could be actually codified and reproduced. And so that was one of the products of the movie I was happiest to see, is that folks scholars, practitioners began to look at, oh, it doesn't just have to be colonial style. There are these other forms that we can begin to document and preserve and maybe even restore. And so it's those things that I think are most inspiring over time, that we're going to see kind of a breaking out of the mold of what we've kind of trapped ourselves in, about what's efficient, what's aesthetically pleasing, that we can open up and see different kinds of construction that just reinvigorates every aspect of these professions, that it just frees us to say, oh no, we didn't have to do it just the way we always did it. You know, working with a colleague that's down in Australia on this idea of brutal scapes, and how do you kind of escape the trappings of having to impose a sense of order, a sense of, you know, Western order on the spaces that people find to be engaging or effective, you know, efficient. That stuff, you know, just to have a vision of possibility in a film. You know, I know there are going to be people your age and 10 years younger than you, 20 years younger than you, that are going to come up and just see things that I can't see, because their imaginations are going to have a wider array of options available to them.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Hi, Rachel.
Hey, just a follow-up question to that. I've been reading very briefly about Akon buying this city in Uganda, and it's the real life Wakanda. And I'm just curious if you've read up on that and what your opinions are on how that is and isn't reflective of what you're talking about here.
Yeah, I keep an eye. I keep an eye and kind of watch. For the folks who are on the call, I think a few people know, but I'm probably on social media too much. And so if you're ever checking around, yeah, that's where I see a lot of those updates, and I kind of swing across and see in the different African newspapers I can get a hold of how it's unfolding. But Akon's well-intentioned. He wants to do a lot of really good things. I think he is beholden to investors who don't always share kind of his aspirations in the ideal form. And so there's a lot of repetition of kind of exploitative tactics, you know, exploitation that can happen under his umbrella. And because he has some leverage, but he doesn't have total control. And so it's why I talk a lot about economic autonomy, both in the US and around the world, is that you gotta be really careful who your partners are. And as you try and invest and redesign on that kind of scale, giving the local community some control and being a voice for folks to say what they want to achieve and not assume that your vision is going to be superior. It can replicate a lot of the bad habits, again, we have embedded in the way we go about these conversations. And so I know a lot of folks on the ground that have critiques of Akon and the different initiatives he's taken on, and he doesn't always include local voices who express concerns.
Thank you.
I thought of a question.
Mm-hmm.
So while we're on the topic of Wakanda, so I read a few years ago when the movie was released that it was Wakanda is based on Ethiopia, which is something, being of Ethiopian heritage, that I found a very interesting thing. So I was just wondering if you can comment on that. Is it just the imagination of Ethiopians, or is there any truth to that?
You muted me just as I was about to answer.
I meant to mute my.
It's all good. So complicated answer. Ethiopia, in the broadest, most kind of Western Christian stereotype of what Ethiopia was, a nation that stretches back with its history of having independence as a Christian nation, to over 2,000 years. This is, just a completely different line than the Byzantine system or the Roman system. Just there's a sense of Ethiopia as a center for African civilization that is, for the Western European, kind of mythological, but in a different sense entirely for folks of the African diaspora, folks who are largely out of Western or Southwestern Africa and caught up in the transatlantic slave trade. There's a very different specific history of coming back and fighting for Ethiopia's independence, for instance, against Italy, that shapes a lot of that sense of connection and relationship. But I think it's largely symbolic. There's not a whole lot of grounding in the specific history of Ethiopia or grounding in the languages of Ethiopia. And so it's a symbol, and it's a kind of metaphorical reference to say there is this actual independent African society that has this deep history that has resisted the kinds of wages of colonialism and European extraction in many ways. But I always run into problems with folks who know African history, and it's very specific to Southern Africa, it's very specific to Western Africa, and almost invariably they know nothing about East Africa, and particularly Kenya and Ethiopia. And so this is another piece of this thing about Africa as a continent and how aware are you of the depth and detail in all of the different countries. So yes, people associate the symbol and mythology they have of Ethiopia with this kind of fictional creation of Wakanda. Overall, the producers, the people who constructed the script and the production design, they were very purposeful about taking multiple kinds of African fashion, African language, kinds of African cultural movements. They wanted to build in a Pan-African set of symbols that were likely to resonate with people outside of the continent in the way the imagery was created. So yeah, there are elements of Ethiopia within it, but it's not substantive. I'm getting in trouble with the people I talk to. Like, it is just designed to look exotic enough. It's a form of Orientalism to counter kind of Western perceptions, but to then ground it. The opening scene is shot in Nigeria at night in like northern woods and foothills. It's not Nigeria. And they shoot a lot of stuff for those films in Nigeria. Still doesn't approximate any kind of real knowledge or engagement with Nigeria as a society. And so the real formative answer is new, but I know what people are trying to do when they make that connection. They're just trying to say Ethiopia is this amazing place that we don't know enough about, and we've kind of ignored its culture and history. So shouldn't we learn more about it? Absolutely. But they've got to go way beyond just knowing Wakanda to get there.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, what class is everybody here for? I'm not really sure, but I knew what course that was.
It's called Future Cities.
Oh, it is literally a Future Cities class. So what places have you looked at to kind of study and talk about coming into tonight?
So maybe students can answer that question. A lot of people have been quiet. So Erin, do you want to try?
Sure. Hi, thank you for the presentation. So our modules throughout the class are touch on sort of the thematic. So technology, economics, sustainability, that sort of thing. But I will credit our instructors with giving us lots of freedom to look at podcasts and videos and other things that are maybe not as traditionally sourced for urban planning sort of classes. So yeah.
A particular future city you'd like to visit or maybe even build?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like I'm so bogged down in the here and now. I'm a part-time evening student. I think a future city. I spend a lot of time myself in I work for the trade association that represents engineering and architecture and planning firms on Capitol Hill and elsewhere. And you know, the concept of net zero, the concept of carbon neutrality, the concept of how we draw energy, and how we pay for infrastructure is a lot of what I do during the day. So a future city where energy, you know, and where sustainability is not just about green building, but about how we power ourselves, I think is as far as I can go futuristically myself. But thank you for asking.
Yes, no, it's awesome. On those questions, a lot of folks like to retrofit Paris because it's already high density.
Yeah.
And so, you know,
Yeah.
they're trying to kind of solve a few problems, and you don't really want to sprawl like Phoenix. You know?
Right. No.
So no, it's good to hear. And the work you're doing is so important. Just, you know, keep on the path and keep looking for what you think is a good alternative. I actually thought I had kind of in my head built out a whole other thing on like Virginia as where it can go, especially as you get kind of Metro DC, Maryland kind of growing and expanding really rapidly. So I didn't know if folks had other thoughts or questions about how that area might become a little bit better in the next decade or two.
Okay. So if there are no questions, Dr. Greason, if you wanted to say a couple of things just as a wrap up for people to take as a reminder or a takeaway, that would be great.
Well, uniquely for everybody here, I will put it in the chat, visit a organization that I love. I mentioned it with Steve earlier. It's called the Society for City and Regional Planning History. I want to make sure I said the acronym correctly. And so we publish a journal of planning history. We, you know, get together every couple of years and partner with the Urban History Association. But it is just so much fun to get together with people who study this material, who are trying to figure out good solutions, not just in the US, but around the world. There's so many good chances to do this stuff and, you know, ultimately have a great life. Like I had a chance recently to reflect on, you know, what is my like bucket list life goal kind of thing. I was like, I want to visit as many capital cities as I can, just capital cities, just often where I can go see another capital city. And they're just gorgeous. And you see all these different choices people make and how they unfold. And, you know, I've seen a couple dozen, but there's a lot more, hundreds. And so, you know, if you love travel, if you love seeing how places are designed and, you know, this kind of work, it's endless and it's endlessly rewarding. And so, you know, I thank y'all for the chance, and especially start talking about fictional places and you can build all your virtual cities. You know, I'm the nerdy dad who plays with his kids in Minecraft and Fortnite, and we're building all kinds of craziness online. And so there's just no end to your creativity and the ways you can apply it, and more productively, you know, the policy side of working with municipal governments and state governments to try and correct really bad issues of waste, or, you know, getting to, you know, carbon zero. Those kinds of projects, we need everybody. We need everybody. If you have any gifts to work in that way, your work will make a difference to save, you know, millions, billions of lives going forward. So it's not just lovely and enjoyable and fun. It's extraordinarily important too. And that's why I love the fact that you're taking classes like this, and appreciate the chance to sit with you.
Thank you very much, everybody. And we wish you all a wonderful night. Thank you, Dr. Greason.
My joy. Please have a great evening.
Bye.
Thank you, Walter.